Was Queen Elizabeth I really a man? I can't believe I'm even asking this question, let alone covering it in a video. Until now, I've deliberately avoided the topic because, quite frankly, it's ridiculous. However, a recent article gave this theory some attention, so let's talk about it. After all, it serves as a fascinating example of how, in cases like this, misogyny hasn't been the sole driving force behind the idea, though for most of history, it has been central. Welcome back to Lemmy History. I actually have a weakness for conspiracy theories. The princes in the tower and the countless possibilities surrounding their fate make up 90% of my channel. Just recently, we explored whether Elizabeth I may have died from her lead-based makeup, but I try to steer clear of theories, so-called theories, that are less about historical truth and more about personal agendas. That said, I usually get so frustrated that I eventually tackle them anyway, and now, that moment has arrived. I'll start by briefly outlining the theory before examining its origins, because in this case the origins alone reveal a lot about its credibility. Then, I'll explore two contradictory interpretations from the 20th century, illustrating why misogyny wasn't the only factor that kept this idea alive. After a quick look at its resurgence in the 21st century, I'll wrap up with solid evidence debunking the theory once and for all. Finally, I'll share some thoughts on why, despite all logic, this conspiracy theory refuses to die. The theory suggests that the real Elizabeth did exist, but died of a fever shortly before her 9th birthday. This is said to have happened in the town of Bisley in the Cotswolds, which is why the theory is often called the Bisley Boy. Allegedly, King Henry VIII had sent his daughter there to protect her from a plague outbreak in London, hoping to keep her safe. When Elizabeth died, her governess, Lady Catherine Ashley, and her guardian Thomas Parry reportedly panicked. Henry VIII was infamous for his ruthless vindictiveness, and they feared he would have them executed if he discovered that his daughter had died under their care. They even considered fleeing the country, but ultimately feared that the king would take revenge on their families. The situation worsened when Henry decided to visit his daughter during his summer travels. Time was running out. Ashley initially planned to have Elizabeth buried in a stone tomb and replace her with a suitable girl, but with the king's imminent arrival, that became impossible. Instead, she and Parry supposedly chose a boy whose facial features resembled the young princess. Since Henry was accustomed to his daughter being quiet, he reportedly noticed nothing amiss, and the deception succeeded. According to the theory, this boy was then forced to live out his life as Elizabeth Tudor, which supposedly explains why the Queen never married and remained a lifelong virgin. Her heavy makeup in later years, conspiracy theorists claim, was actually an attempt to disguise masculine features. Supporters of this theory also point to statements made by Elizabeth that they believe hinted at her true identity. One such example is her famous address to the troops at Tilbury. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." According to conspiracy theorists, this was meant to be taken literally. At least that's the claim made by the theory's most well-known proponent, Dracula author Bram Stoker. He first published his beliefs in Famous Impostors, a book released in 1910. In the second half of the 19th century, Bram Stoker visited Gloucestershire, stopping in Bisley. During the May Day celebrations, he witnessed something unusual: a boy dressed in Elizabethan-style women's clothing, acting as the May Queen. Curious about the tradition, Stoker asked the locals for its origins and was told a remarkable story. According to local accounts, a mid-19th century priest had discovered a stone coffin while overseeing construction work on the church grounds. When the coffin was opened, it revealed the remains of a young girl dressed in Tudor-era clothing. The priest concluded that the body belonged to Elizabeth I, who had allegedly been replaced by a boy named Neville. Since then, it had become a village tradition to dress a boy as the Queen during the May festivities. This naturally raises two questions. How did the priest determine that the girl was Elizabeth? And how did he come up with the story about a boy named Neville? It's unclear whether Stoker himself ever asked these questions. What is certain, however, is that the discovery sparked his imagination as a writer. He compared Elizabeth's handwriting from before and after 1542 and concluded that they were not the same. The exact years of the manuscript samples he analyzed remain unknown, but his conclusion overlooked an obvious fact. An 8-year-old's writing in a classroom would naturally differ from that of a 25-year-old composing a letter. Still, Stoker had a major issue to address. How could Henry VIII have failed to recognize that the child presented to him was not his own daughter? And beyond Henry, what about Elizabeth's other relatives? Her half-sister Mary had spent years with her. Surely she would have noticed the deception. The locals had no explanation for this inconsistency, so Stoker devised his own. The boy must have been an unknown child of Henry Fitzroy, the king's illegitimate son, and Mary Howard. In other words, Elizabeth was supposedly sent to the one place where, by sheer coincidence, an unrecorded grandson of Henry VIII just happened to live, one whom the king himself had never heard of, nor any member of the powerful Howard family. At this point, the theory already strains credibility, but despite its obvious flaws, it continued to resurface throughout the 20th century. For the sake of completeness, it's worth noting that Stoker also cited a quote from Elizabeth's tutor, Roger Ascham. "The constitution of her mind is exempt from female weakness, and she is imbued with a masculine power of application. In the whole manner of her life, she rather resembles Hippolyte than Phaedra." Stoker also referenced a brief message from one of Elizabeth's supervisors to Ascham, informing him that he would need to slow the pace of his lessons. This message dates to the period after the supposed switch. However, this contradicts the theory itself. If Elizabeth had secretly become a man, why would her tutor need to slow down rather than praise her, or rather his, intelligence? In the end, the entire theory unravels under its own weight. In the second half of the 20th century, medical historian Bacon proposed a new explanation for Elizabeth's success. This time, the theory did not revolve around a supposed body swap. Instead, Bacon speculated that Elizabeth had experienced a case of testicular feminization, an outdated term for what is now known as androgen insensitivity syndrome, AIS. Men with AIS have an inadequate response to androgens, leading to a female appearance despite their male genetic makeup. Bacon's theory was presented in a 1985 paper, which I've linked in the description. I'm not a medical expert, but from what I understand, the reaction from other specialists was overwhelmingly skeptical. Then, in 1995, another version of Elizabeth as a man emerged. This time it was introduced by author Chris Hunt in his historical novel The Bisley Boy. The novel explored homosexual relationships and reimagined Elizabeth as a man to cast her alleged affairs with male favorites in a new light. According to Hunt's story, her true gender had been concealed due to homophobia. Hunt makes it clear that his work is a historical novel. However, the provocative idea of a secretly male queen engaging in same-sex relationships captured the imagination of many authors. Some began speculating whether there was truth behind the fiction. As a result, Elizabeth's gender became not only a target of misogyny, but also a casualty of historical misinterpretation, misused by those who, lacking historical knowledge, sought to combat homophobia in a context where it simply didn't apply. In 2013, another novel reignited the debate about Elizabeth's gender, this time from author Steve Berry. His book, The King's Deception, follows a U.S. Justice Department operative who runs an antiquarian bookstore in Copenhagen and stumbles upon the mystery of the Queen's true identity. Of particular interest is Berry's writer's note, in which he outlines what he believes to be historically accurate based on his research and what he fabricated for dramatic effect. Unfortunately, much of it is pure nonsense. Berry claims that Elizabeth forbade doctors from examining her, always wore clothing that covered her entire body, and had facial features in portraits that were not feminine enough. He also argues that her energy levels were completely different from those of her siblings, and that she lived significantly longer than her father, grandfather, and both siblings. I will probably never understand why, if Elizabeth was truly hiding her identity, she would have approved portraits of herself that supposedly exposed her secret. As for her energy levels, they were quite similar to those of her brother Edward. Mary, by contrast, suffered from poor health from an early age and battled severe depression. Elizabeth's two siblings both died of serious illnesses, and she nearly shared their fate when she contracted smallpox. Henry VIII's infamous health issues, meanwhile, were largely due to his diet and chronic leg problems. Berry also claims that Elizabeth's grave has never been opened, which is simply untrue. Originally, she was buried in the vault with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. However, her successor, James I, later moved her remains to a separate tomb in Westminster Abbey to make space for himself beside Henry VII. Since then, the grave has not been reopened. Despite these inaccuracies, Barry concludes by calling for Elizabeth's tomb to be opened to determine once and for all whether she was truly a woman. It's difficult for me not to be harsh about this claim because it highlights just how appallingly poor Barry's research was. As queen, Elizabeth was examined multiple times by doctors to assess her fertility in preparation for potential marriage. Her menstrual cycles were documented and confirmed by both domestic and foreign physicians. When her former brother-in-law, Philip of Spain, considered marrying her, he even went so far as to bribe some of her ladies-in-waiting to verify her fertility. They provided him with bloody evidence of her menstruation. Elizabeth was constantly surrounded by a large number of ladies-in-waiting, even while dressing. It is well documented that she did not always have a good relationship with them, and yet at no point did any of them ever claim she was a man. Additionally, countless rumors circulated at her court about alleged love affairs. No one ever tried to discredit these stories by pointing out that the queen was actually male, so much so that she could not have possibly fathered the 2 to 4 supposed children she was rumored to have had with Robert Dudley. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had many enemies who spread vicious rumors about her. Yet, the idea that she was secretly a man never emerged, not for 250 years. It wasn't until the Victorian era that such speculation took root. As I mentioned in my last video about Elizabeth, the Victorians viewed their own queen, Victoria, as the moral opposite of Elizabeth I. Victoria famously said that she was first a wife, then a queen, which aligned far better with the social ideals of the time. The problem, of course, was that Elizabeth had undeniably been a highly successful ruler. The simplest way for those who couldn't reconcile her achievements with their rigid ideas of womanhood was to claim that she was never really a woman at all. And just to set the record straight, Elizabeth was not in Bisley in the summer of 1542. She was at Hatfield House during the peak of summer, and before that at Enfield Palace for her lessons. Meanwhile, Henry VIII was preoccupied with the looming war against Scotland. His illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, died before he could have had a child with Mary Howard. And even if he had, the Howards, who were influential at court, would never have passed up the opportunity to publicly acknowledge a child of royal blood, especially during the reign of Jane Seymour. Ultimately, those who keep this baseless rumor alive do so for reasons that have everything to do with the present and nothing to do with actual history. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to help my channel grow.